Good evening, folks. Hope everybody is doing well tonight. This is part 2 in my series of lessons on animal respiratory systems. If you have not already watched part 1 in this series, I recommend you go back and do that now. If you are in my biology class, make sure that you have a copy of the handout and summary of lecture notes for this unit from the Blackboard site so that you have the spellings of important words and just reference for important concepts. Also, if you got your textbook handy, that's not a bad idea to open to this chapter in your textbook and look for a diagram of bird respiration, because we're going to be talking about that, and it's a little bit strange. All right, then. So we left off last time having identified basic features of animal respiratory systems. We talked about respiratory media and surfaces. We described a couple of different kinds of respiratory systems. We talked about why flat-bodied animals and sponges do not need them. And we took a look at tracheal systems, gill systems, and pulmonary systems as seen in vertebrates. In particular, we were tracing our way through the vertebrates or mammalian pulmonary system, and we had gotten as far as the end of the upper respiratory tract. So that's, I think, where we're going to pick up. So you might recall, we've taken air in through the nares, up through the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx, down into the oropharynx, alternate pathway from mouth to oral cavity to oropharynx, down from there into the laryngopharynx, and now we find ourselves at the glottis, which is the opening to the larynx, L-A-R-Y-N-X, the larynx or the voice box. This is the first component of your lower respiratory tract. Now, on either side of the larynx, we are going to find some stretched out bands of tissue called the vocal cords, and that's cords C-O-R-D-S. The vocal cords are going to vibrate in response to our instruction. Basically, whenever you're speaking, you're choosing to adjust the tension on your vocal cords and vibrate them. Air passes over them in order to generate vocalizations. Now, vocalization is not a unique ability of humans. Obviously, there are lots of animals that are capable of vocalizing. Not all of them have the same apparatus of vocal cords that we do. We have a unique bone called the hyoid bone, H-Y-O-I-D, that is the only bone in your body that does not articulate with another bone. It's suspended in the cartilage of the larynx. It anchors the vocal cords and gives us our speech capabilities. Other animals capable of speech, such as parrots and crows, do this in other ways. They have different anatomical setups by which they achieve the trick of vocalization. Now, the larynx or voice box varies in structure from one species to another, but most species do in fact have one because most animals are capable of some form of vocalization. I guess vertebrates, I should be saying, not most animals. Most vertebrates are capable of some form of vocalization. Vocalization can fulfill a wide range of purposes. It can be a warning cry, get away from me. It can be a fear signal, which is also generally get away from me. Vocalization can be a mating call, advertising your mating availability. It can be a territory signal, wolves howling, that's what's going on. They're saying, hey, this is our pack's territory right here. Of course, in social species, it can also be used for a wide range of communication functions, whether that's simple communications along the lines of a mother cat, chirping at her kittens to get them to come after her, whether that is warning cries to say, hey, there's a predator coming, we need to get out of here, cries of distress indicating a need of help, even happy vocalizations that we see in a lot of species, but it also allows for more elaborate communication with particular signals meaning particular things. Language is not unique to us, folks. We are pretty confident that the chirping of dolphins and the singing of whales represents a linguistic form of communication that we have not deciphered. We know that at least one species of monkey, the vervet monkey, has a simple vocal language with words for a few things that vervet monkeys have to worry about, like eagle and big snake and big cat. We know that chimpanzees and gorillas are capable of learning elaborate linguistic patterns when we teach it to them, which suggests they have the brain architecture to do that thing. We know that parrots and crows and ravens can gain extensive vocabularies, including stringing words together in novel ways, not just imitation. So language is not entirely a uniquely human ability. Bird song is a form of language. Different songs advertise different things, and it actually has regional dialects. If you take a bird and raise it in isolation and put it in an area with other birds of its kind, it won't know the bird songs. It will not be able to effectively communicate with other birds in that way. So vocalization fulfills a wide range of biological roles, and the larynx is involved in all of them. It's the resonating chamber for voice, as well as producing vocalizations via vocal cords. Now, continuing down the larynx, we are going to encounter a tube known as the trachea, Trachea, a little bit different meaning than the tracheal system we talked about in the last lesson, but actually kind of similar meaning. This trachea is the windpipe. It's the tube leading down towards the lungs. The trachea runs down the back of your throat. The esophagus runs behind it. Actually, the esophagus bulges forward into the trachea when you swallow. Instead of the larynx, that mass in your throat right here in the center, that if you push on it, you sound like an old mafioso. But below that, you find the trachea. Trachea is about the diameter of your thumb, descends down towards the lungs. It is actually propped open by little rings of cartilage that keep it from collapsing. And actually, they're not complete rings, they're C-shaped, because that way the esophagus can bulge forward into the gap in the C whenever you swallow. But those rings prop the trachea open so it does not collapse. Here's your fun forensics fact for the day from a former forensic anthropologist, that if you are strangling somebody, it is almost impossible to strangle somebody to death without breaking the C rings around their trachea. So when we see that in a corpse, that's a clear indication of strangulation or neck compression. Now, at the bottom of the trachea, there's a last ring of cartilage called the carina, C-A-R-I-N-A, and then, assuming we're in a vertebrate species with paired lungs, like ourselves, we then branch off from the trachea in two directions to form the bronchi, B-R-O-N-C-H-I. Bronchi are the air tubes, and the bronchi are the key to how we fit as much respiratory space as we need. Singular, by the way, if you're talking about just one of them, is the bronchus, B-R-O-N-C-H-U-S. So, extending from the trachea, you've got paired bronchi, left and right bronchi, that go down into the left and right lungs. Now, in terms of the structure of lungs, in humans at least, and this is a common feature in mammals, the left lung is smaller than the right lung because the left lung has to accommodate the heart. You might recall the heart is a little bit tilted off to the left. About 2/3 of its mass is left of the midline. So the left lung is a little bit smaller than the right lung to accommodate the heart being there. In humans, the left lung is divided into 2 lobes or compartments, the right lung into 3 lobes. Each of those lobes is divided into smaller compartments called segments. 9 segments per lobe in the left lung, 10 segments per lobe in the right lung, so you have a total of 48 segments. Now, here's how the bronchi do the thing of getting all that surface area, that 70 square feet or so, 70 square meters, excuse me, that I mentioned in the last lesson, into that lung. So if you look at your lungs, they're not that big. Cone-shaped organs, the point comes to right about here. Base rests on your diaphragm, D-I-A-P-H-R-A, silent G-M. Diaphragm is the sheet of muscles separating the abdominal cavity from the thoracic cavity. So lungs go there to there. Not that much space, not 70 square meters, right? That would be if the lung was a big empty bag. The lung is not a big empty bag. The lung is first off divided into smaller compartments, and what happens is that as the bronchi enter the lungs, they begin to branch. You have the first bronchi, the left and right ones that come off of the carina. Those are the primary bronchi. Those then branch when they get into each lung into secondary bronchi, also called lobar bronchi, L-O-B-A-R, because one goes to each lobe. So 2 in the left lung, 3 in the right. Once they get into the lobes, they branch further into tertiary or segmental bronchi, one going to each segment. So 18 in the left lung, 30 in the right lung. And then they keep branching. And they branch and they branch and they branch and they branch smaller and smaller and smaller, up to 16 generations of branching. We're getting microscopic at this point. And then they keep branching still. After 16 generations of branching, we now get to tiny little passages called bronchioles, B-R-O-N-C-H-I-O-L-E-S. I-O-L-E-S. And you have about 7 generations of bronchioles, branching even tinier. And then those finally terminate in a little channel called an alveolar duct, A-L-V-E-O-L-A-R, and those lead into air sacs known as alveoli. A-L-V-E-O-L-I. If you're talking about just one of them, it is an alveolus, U-S instead of I at the end. Although I don't know why you talk about just one of them, because you have 300 million of them. By the time you have all that branching from all those bronchi, you have 300 million alveoli, that the air sacs that those bronchi terminate in. It is because of all that branching that we have way more surface area inside of the lungs than they appear to have from the outside. They have a much more complex interior, deeply folded, lots of branching, lots of little tiny air sacs, and collectively that surface area is way bigger than their external appearance would seem to suggest. And that is how we have the amazing amount of respiratory surface area packed into those lungs, which is needed to sustain our endothermic metabolism. Those alveoli have a lining of a very thin epithelial membrane, a simple squamous epithelium. Oxygen and carbon dioxide easily diffuse across it. They are surrounded by pulmonary capillary beds, which hopefully you remember from our lesson on circulatory systems, which load up on oxygen from the blood and unload carbon dioxide, which can then be exhaled. So that's the basic arrangement of my vertebrate respiratory tract. Pretty much the same in vertebrates across the board, some small variations in structure of voice box, or in shape of lungs, or number of lobes or segments, or in a couple of other little details, but basically the pathway I've laid out is pretty vertebrate universal. Now, more than one way to breathe, because after all, we have to inflate those lungs. And I'm here to tell you that those lungs do not have muscle tissue in them. The lungs are not able to expand and contract on their own. However, the lungs are attached by way of connective tissue sacs to the inside of your thoracic wall. And that they're also attached to the diaphragm. And this allows us to engage in breathing along with them. But there are two basic kinds of breathing. There are two ways that a vertebrate can breathe, and any given vertebrate does one or the other. If you are an amphibian, if you're a frog or a salamander, some kind of amphibian that actually has lungs to breathe, you engage in what is called positive pressure breathing, which means that you force air down into your lungs. Here's the way positive pressure breathing works. I'm a frog. What happens when I breathe is I open my mouth and I lower the floor of my oral cavity. You know how frogs puff up their throats? Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're lowering the floor of the oral cavity to take in air. Then what happens is the animal closes its mouth, closes its nostrils, that's a thing a frog can do that you cannot, and then raises the floor of its oral cavity. That has the effect of pushing the air downward. It can't go anywhere else with the mouth and the nostrils closed, so the air is pushed downward through the animal's pharynx and ultimately into its lungs. After that happens, the animal will open its mouth, and elastic recoil of the lung will cause the air to be pushed back up and out, releasing the croaking sound that you associate with your frog peeping. So that is positive pressure breathing, pushing the air down. You do not do that. You engage in negative pressure breathing. Negative pressure breathing is the default respiratory pattern of all non-amphibian vertebrates. It's what you do. It's what reptiles do. Birds have a slightly different way of doing this, but theirs is a negative pressure breathing system as well. Now, in negative pressure breathing, rather than forcing air down into the lungs, we are going to suck air down into the lungs. Your lungs function as a suction pump. Here's how that works. When you breathe in, by the way, the proper term for this is inspiration. I-N-S-P-I-R-A-T-I-O-N. Inspiration is breathing in. Expiration, E-X-P-I-R-A-T-I-O-N, is breathing out. My favorite joke from one of my old anatomy professors was, when you breathe in, you inspire. If you are unable to do that, you will expire. But you're going to expire one way or the other, because breathing out is it wasn't a very good joke. All right, so during inspiration, what happens in most vertebrates is that the muscles of the rib cage cause the rib cage to elevate. Take a deep breath. Rib cage elevated, right? Your diaphragm also went downward. Your diaphragm moved down, your rib cage elevated. That had the effect of stretching out the walls of the lungs, expanding the thoracic cavity. And if you know your basic physics, you probably know that if you expand the size of a space, the pressure within it will drop. So we expand the lungs by stretching them out with the elevation of the rib cage, lowering of the diaphragm. As the lungs get larger, pressure inside of them drops. And the pressure gradient, pressure always goes from high to low, causes air to be sucked down into the lungs from our upper respiratory tract. When we expire, we do the opposite. The rib cage will lower, the diaphragm will elevate. That has the effect of shrinking the thoracic cavity and pushing air forcefully out. So this is an effective way of emptying the lung after it has been filled. Now, some animals benefit from an extra assist with this. If you are a quadruped, if you are, if you don't know that word, Quadruped, you've probably heard me use that word before. Quadruped means a four-legged animal. If you're a quadruped, then your organs are kind of hanging down, right? You know, your visceral organs are suspended in that belly that hangs below the underside of your body. Now, sometime run up and down a set of steps. You will notice you feel jiggling in your chest, right? You'll feel, your heart bouncing up and down a little bit within there. Your viscera bounce up and down a little bit. They're not firmly wedged in place in your abdominal and thoracic cavity. They have a little bit of wiggle room. Now, if I am a quadruped, when I run, my organs will slide within my cavity horizontally. And so you'll find that when a quadruped is running quickly, that it will benefit from an assist with breathing called the visceral pump, V-I-S-C-E-R-A-L. The visceral pump, the word visceral meaning having to do with the viscera, the internal organs, that basically, as your internal organs slide back and forth horizontally within that hanging belly, that has the effect of stretching lung and then putting more pressure on it, causing the lung to both evacuate more air at a time when you breathe out and suck air in more forcefully when it comes back the other way. This means that a quadruped that is running is able to effectively ventilate better, and that allows it to sustain the activity of running, the high energy activity involved there. Now, over a short distance, you will outrun a horse over a short distance, but the horse will outpace you any day of the week because the visceral pump lets the horse ventilate its lungs way better than you can. Speaking of, another feature of horizontality involved in respiratory tracts. You might be aware that one of the deficiencies of our sensory abilities is that we have pretty crappy olfaction. O-L-F-A-C-T-I-O-N. Olfaction is our sense of smell. The olfactory membrane is located in the roof of the nasal cavity. Now, for you, olfaction is not a very good sense. Primates in general are not good at olfaction. Part of the reason is because they have less olfactory membrane than most animals do, and two, because it's located way up in the top of the nasal cavity where it's harder to ventilate. You want to know how something smells? I got this nice orange peel here. I want to smell it. I have to sniff, right? Just holding it under my nose. I'm not really drifting up there. But I draw in the chemical, and I smell the orange peel. That's because I have to actively ventilate it. It is harder for you to smell things. This is not to say scents can't penetrate your nose without you sniffing, but you know that when you want to focus on a smell, what do? You sniff. We have to deliberately try to ventilate our olfactory membrane. And we have less of it relative to our body and brain size than most mammals do. Most mammals have a snout, an elongated face. Think about your dog or your cat where they have that protruding area around the nasal cavity. Their nasal cavity is lined with olfactory membrane along the whole length. They have more olfactory membrane relative to body size than you do. Proportionally, they have more than you do. They have more brain space dedicated to processing olfactory signals so they can distinguish smells better than you can. And the horizontal orientation of most animals' nasal passageways means that scent molecules can more easily ventilate, and it's easier for scent molecules to diffuse into the nares and pass through the nasal cavity when you don't have to suck the air upward to make it happen. So this is one reason why quadrupeds, like your dog, have a way stronger sense of smell than you do. It has to do with the anatomical orientation of those passageways. So that's basically the visceral pump helps, and also the horizontal orientation helps with scent as well. Now, important thing to know about this, you do not ever fully empty your lungs. There's always some dead air in there, because if you fully emptied them, your lungs would collapse, and that would be very bad for you. Anybody who's ever had a collapsed lung, or anybody who's worked in emergency medicine and had to deal with a patient with a collapsed lung, you know it's a non-trivial problem. So we want to avoid lungs collapsing, so we leave some air in there. There's some dead air in the lungs at all times. Whenever an animal breathes in, normal breath in is called the tidal volume, T-I-D-A-L. Tidal volume is the size of a normal breath in, normal breath out. In humans, the tidal volume is about 500 milliliters. In other words, normally we breathe in about half a liter of air at a time and breathe that back out again. Now, you can suck in more air than that. Your inspiratory capacity, as we call it, is the maximum amount of air you can pull in most species. The inspiratory capacity is about 6 or 7 times the vital capacity. And in humans, 6 or 7 times the, lost my train of thought, the tidal volume. The maximum amount of air that you can breathe in, followed by the maximum amount of air you can push out, is what we call your vital capacity. So breathe in as hard as you can, breathe out as much as you can. That is your vital capacity. Because tidal volume is not the maximum you can breathe out either. Try it. After a normal breath, try to push more air out of your lungs. You can do it, but it gets real uncomfortable real fast, right? Because you're squeezing your lungs, but you can't fully squeeze all the air out of them. There's a certain volume of air that always stays in the lung called the residual volume, R-E-S-I-D-U-A-L. The residual volume prevents the lung from collapsing. But the trade-off is you always have some dead air in there that's already been deoxygenated, and as such, there's always some volume of air in your lungs that is not providing oxygen. Or to put it another way, your lungs are not benefiting from the full capacity that they could be getting if they didn't have that dead air in there. This is an evolutionary trade-off for all of this. You do need to keep a certain amount of carbon dioxide in your body, by the way. You need a little bit of it to help regulate your pH. Carbon dioxide is needed for carbonic acid, but most of it is what you're going to want to exhale. Most of what you're exhaling, however, is not carbon dioxide. It's mostly nitrogen. 79% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. You mostly pull in nitrogen when you breathe in. You mostly push it out when you breathe out. Some of the oxygen you inhale is going to be exhaled as well, because remember, there's some dead air in there. We're not getting every molecule of oxygen that we inhale. By the way, vital capacity in humans, on average, for an adult human male, vital capacity comes in at about 4.8 liters. For an adult human female, around 3.4 to 3.5 liters. So on average, the male of our species, given height and given build, has approximately, I don't know what percentage off the top of my head, but has a higher vital capacity than the female of our species by about a liter, liter and a half. Now, when we're talking about respiratory control, important thing to know about this. Control of your respiratory system is, for the most part, involuntary. It's largely regulated by the brainstem. There are 2 parts of the brainstem involved in this. We have what are called respiratory control centers located in the brainstem. They are found in 2 portions, the medulla oblongata, remember that when we talked about nervous systems, the brainstem proper, and the pons, P-O-N-S, that little bulge right anterior to the medulla oblongata. Those are the regions that control the depth and pulse of your breathing, how quickly you breathe and how deeply you breathe. The respiratory center in the medulla oblongata is primarily concerned with controlling the pace and depth of breathing. The pontine, P-O-N-T-I-N-E, respiratory center is concerned with preventing your lungs from overinflating by switching you from inhaling to exhaling. That's what the pons does in all of this. Now you have tiny sense organs, chemoreceptors, located in your blood vessels that monitor your body's level of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Those are sense organs that you are never consciously aware of the sensation they provide. They're part of your visceral sensory system. They send signals to the medulla oblongata and the pons, alerting it to how much oxygen and carbon dioxide you have. You might be surprised to learn that carbon dioxide levels are the biggest determinant in how deep you breathe. It's more about eliminating excess CO2 than it is about taking in more oxygen. And the reason for that is because we take in much more oxygen than we need. Your average tidal volume breath is pulling in about twice as much oxygen as you require. You can safely get away with having about 1/2 of one lung and still get all the oxygen your body needs. We can see this in active because, think about high altitudes. If you're at a high altitude, the atmosphere is thinner. That is when we're going to find less oxygen coming in. That is when the brain is going to respond and say, uh-oh, we need to breathe deeper and more frequently to get the oxygen that is required, because that's the issue. But in day-to-day life, when you're not going to a higher altitude, oxygen levels are going to hold pretty steady unless you're trapped somewhere where you can't get air or something like that. So more than anything else, it's CO2 levels, regulating pH, that is get rid of some excess CO2 to raise the pH of our blood. CO2 is acidic in solution, or to make sure that you're not building up excess CO2 that can raise and lower your respiratory rate accordingly. Now, interesting thing about this, our breathing rate is not only affected by those centers. Conscious data can also impact your respiratory rates. When you see stimuli that trigger a fight or flight response, when you become angry, frightened, sexually aroused, excited, anything that basically preps the body for action, that further stimulates the lungs to breathe deeper and faster. Basically, it's pulling more air in response to that stimulus, which has said to you, hey, I'm about to do a thing that I might need more energy for, therefore I need to speed up my respiration rate, therefore I need more oxygen. So sensory data like that can also impact your breathing. Likewise, whenever your brain turns off, whenever really turns off, but when you go to sleep, when you rest, you're going to find that your respiratory centers are going to stimulate a slowdown of breathing, slower, deeper breaths rather than quicker breaths. Because you don't need as much O2 coming in, and your body is going into a parasympathetic, relaxing state. So that's the regulation, except for one part I did not mention, and that is a really cool thing about animal respiratory systems, that if you have a pulmonary system, you have a unique ability with that you do not have with your circulatory, your digestive, or your other background activities in the body. Namely, you have the ability to consciously step in and control your breathing. You cannot do that with your heart. You cannot sit here and say, okay, I want my heart to beat faster. I guess you could think about stressful things or run to make it do that, but you cannot just choose to make your heart beat faster or slower. Likewise, you cannot choose to stimulate the secretion of digestive juices. You can't choose to make peristalsis happen in your intestines. You have no control over that stuff. It's completely autonomic. Breathing is regulated autonomically. In the background, your body sets the pulse of breathing under normal circumstances. About average human breathing is about 12 breaths per minute at rest. Your brainstem handles that. You don't have to think to breathe, but you can. You can consciously step in and change your rate of breathing. That means you can choose to breathe deeper. Choose to breathe faster or slower. Choose to breathe faster, right? To pant, to hyperventilate, You can consciously step in and do those things. You can even choose to induce apnea, A-P-N-E-A, Apnea is the cessation of breathing. You can choose to stop breathing. You can hold your breath. Why can we do this? Why, of all of our autonomic reflexes, are we able to step in and choose when to breathe or not to breathe? Why can we consciously override that basic reflex? A couple of reasons. For starters, vocalization. If you want to make noises that are under your conscious control, whether that noise is speech, whether that noise is shouting, whether that noise is singing, whether that noise is screaming, any kind of conscious vocalization that an animal makes using the respiratory system requires it to control the movement of air through its larynx. And as such, that means that animal has to be able to start and stop breathing where needed in order to create the exact sounds that we are creating. You actually, when you speak, you are stopping and starting breathing in a bunch of spots during that to regulate the rate at which air flows over your vocal cords to make particular sounds or to make particular volumes of sound. Vocal cords adjust to control the pitch of your voice. Adjusting the vocal cords controls high pitch, low pitch, that sort of thing. But the respiratory part is controlling how much air moves over the vocal cords and when it does. And the teeth, the tongue, the jaws all shape the noises being made. Your nasopharynx actually adds resonance to your voice, so do your nasal sinuses. That's why you get that weird nasally sounding voice when you're congested. So yeah, we have to be able to control breathing to control vocalization. We also have to be able to control breathing in the event that we find ourselves in water. If you have a pulmonary system, you cannot breathe underwater, at least not without surfacing to get a gulp of air. And even then, you're inducing apnea until you come to the surface again. Our ability to induce apnea when we end up in water means that we don't automatically drown and fill up our lungs whenever we fall into a body of water, and it means we can swim and dive and so forth, which is useful for a lot of animals that are preying on fish or shellfish or other aquatic resources, or escaping from prey in water, that sort of thing. Speaking of escaping from prey, another possibility is holding your breath to make less noise. Think about it. It's the werewolf movie, right? You're in the dark house and the werewolf is coming. And you hear him come into the room and you're under the desk, tucked up in there and wrapped in a ball. You hold your breath, right? You don't want him to hear you breathing. Yeah, it's a hiding technique, both for predator and for prey. Holding the breath is a useful technique in that regard. And finally, if there happen to be noxious vapors, if there are dangerous chemicals in the air, like, for example, you're in a forest fire and there's smoke burning around you, being able to hold your breath while you get away from the noxious vapor is a really important survival strategy. So there are a bunch of reasons why being able to step in and induce apnea is a really important thing to be able to do. Unlike your heart, your lungs have a neurogenic rhythm. They're strictly controlled by the brain. They do not have an autorhythmic ability to set their own pulse of breathing. All right, now to finish out this section, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, as I've been saying a couple times throughout here, that birds are different. That birds have a very different organization of their respiratory tract than you do. And indeed, birds have the most efficient respiratory tracts of any vertebrate. They are way better at collecting oxygen from air than you are. They have to be. For starters, birds are largely small-bodied animals. Small-bodied animal means higher metabolic rate. You got to get in more oxygen per unit of air taken in. Secondly, birds fly. Well, okay, not all birds fly, but birds, for the most part, fly, and that means they need to power flight. And I've mentioned it more than once in this course, that flight is one of the most expensive things, energetically speaking, that an animal can do. Maintaining your mass against gravity is very energetically costly. And therefore, you need to really ramp up ATP production when you are flying if you want to keep flying. So, birds, as animals that have flight as a primary locomotion adaptation, need a really effective respiratory system in order to get the resources they need to stay in flight. And therefore, they have the most complex respiratory tract of any animal. Now, the way that this works is that birds have no dead air in their lungs. There is never a point when the bird has deoxygenated residual volume residing in its lungs. Now, the bird breathes in, but there are 2 cycles to bird breath. You breathe in, and then that air passes through a tubular lung called a parabronchus. Parabronchi, P-A-R-A-B-R-O-N-C-H-I, are air tubes that are going to have a one-way flow of air through them. The bird breathes in, air moves along the parabronchus, and then the bird has a number of sacs between 7 and 9, depending on the bird species, usually 8 or 9, sacs located throughout its abdomen, its neck, and its wings. They act like bellows. The bird breathes in, air flows along the parabronchus, oxygen being extracted along the full length of it. That one-way flow is just like the countercurrent exchange with fishes, right? You know, we're moving the air along the entire length of that parabronchial tube, which provides the maximum possibility for extracting oxygen from that tube. The air then goes into the air sacs in the abdomen and neck and wings of the bird, fills up those air sacs. That's pulse 1 of the breathing. Pulse 2 of the breathing, the air sacs contract and force the air through another parabronchus. Not the same one it came in through, a parallel tube that runs back up to the animal's upper respiratory tract to release the air. So basically, air breathing is circular in birds. Go down one parabronchus, fill up the bellow-like sacs in the wings, squeeze them, push the air up the other parabronchus. And as with the first one, we're extracting maximum oxygen by moving that volume of air the full way along that respiratory membrane, all along the length of that tube. So basically what this means is that when a bird breathes, the entire respiratory system is ventilated at once, that we are never having dead air. We are continuously bringing in fresh air via one parabronchus and exhaling it via another. The air is always moving, and it's moving along every respiratory surface that the bird has. That affords it maximum possibility for extraction of oxygen and ensures that there is no residual volume in there taking up space that otherwise could be used for gas exchange. So in this way, the bird is able to maintain a much steadier and higher supply of ATP synthesis. It also means that my bird is better at high altitudes than a mammal would be, because in the thinner atmosphere at a higher altitude, the bird is able to meet the demands of metabolism much more readily because of how effectively it's extracting oxygen from the air. It's getting as much oxygen out of that air as it can, way better than you do. If you move to a high altitude, what does your body do? Well, you'll find people who live in the Himalayas, for example, the native tribes like the Sherpas that live there, often have larger lung capacities relative to their body size, and deeper chest cavities than most of the folks who live elsewhere. It's an adaptation that they've developed over time. Your chest is not going to get bigger when you move to the Himalayas, but what your body will do, and what our bodies do to compensate for poor oxygenation at both high altitudes and in polluted environments, is that we add more red blood cells. And by adding more red blood cells, we're not increasing the amount of air we ventilate our lungs with. What we are doing is we are increasing how much oxygen we can extract per volume of air. If you have more red blood cells in the pulmonary capillary beds, you're picking up more oxygen from that breath than you otherwise might. So you're going to find that people who live in high elevation areas, like go to Denver, right? You're going to find that in Denver you have an elevated red blood cell counts. I think I mentioned in my last lesson on circulation that there's the reason why a lot of athletes train in Denver in the off season is because it's well above sea level. When they're living there, their bodies adapt to the higher altitude, thinner atmosphere environment by saying, uh-oh, I'm not getting as much oxygen from this atmosphere. I need more oxygen carrying capability, and they add more red blood cells in order to account for that. So if you take blood samples from high altitude populations as opposed to populations who live at sea level, you will find that the oxygen saturation of the blood can be higher simply because they have a higher red blood cell count. All right, so I think I have at this point given you a pretty decent picture of how animal respiratory systems work. We've examined a bunch of different types of animal respiratory systems, a couple of different ways of breathing, And along the way, I've shown you a little bit about how yours work, because we basically follow the same model as every other mammal in this respect. All right, so thank you for your attention. Hope you all have a good rest of your evening. I'll talk to you soon.